Have you ever heard of an abandoned old hospital in the state of Texas? A once grand building that used to serve thousands of patients, now only the remnants of dark memories remain. Many say that the hospital is no longer empty. Inside, the spirit of a woman roams, seeking justice for her tragic death. Don't even think about approaching, let alone entering. It's said that those who dare to step inside never return safely. This is not just a legend but a real warning. Are you ready to hear her story? St. Mary's Hospital sits on the outskirts of the city, abandoned by both time and humanity. Once, this building was the best healthcare center in the Texas area. But 30 years ago, a horrific incident occurred, causing the hospital to shut down forever. No one really knows what happened on that fateful night, but rumors say that a young woman died in an unnatural way. Martin, a paranormal researcher, received information about the hospital from a colleague. Driven by burning curiosity, he decided to visit the place and investigate what truly happened. As he arrived at the hospital's front yard, a cold wind greeted him, as if something was off from the start. The large creaky door opened into an endless dark hallway. Martin's footsteps echoed, making the atmosphere even more chilling. Each step felt heavy, as if something was holding him back from moving further. The air inside was damp, smelling of rust and grime. But beneath that scent, there was something more metallic. Blood. Martin swallowed hard. Could the ghost stories he'd heard be real? A soft sigh could be heard in the distance. He stopped, trying to listen more closely. But what he heard next wasn't a sigh anymore. It was a whisper. "Leave this place." The whisper was faint, but clear. Martin's heart raced, his hands starting to tremble. Even though fear was creeping in, his curiosity overwhelmed everything else. He stepped further, delving deeper into the increasingly terrifying hospital. Martin walked down the dark corridors, illuminated only by the small flashlight he carried. On either side, patient room doors were mostly shut tight. But one door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar, as if beckoning him. Slowly, Martin approached the door. Behind it was a small room, likely a treatment room. On the wall was a large, stained mirror. As Martin looked into the mirror, a cold chill ran down his spine. His reflection seemed normal, but in the corner of the mirror, there was another face. The face of a pale woman, her hair tangled, and her face covered with wounds. The woman's eyes stared sharply at Martin from the mirror. He quickly turned to see who was behind him, but there was no one in the room. Cold sweat trickled down his body. He looked back at the mirror, and the woman's face was still there, but this time, her lips moved. "Why did you come here?" Her voice echoed in Martin's head, even though her lips only moved in the mirror. Martin stepped back, feeling fear grip his legs. But before he could respond, the mirror in front of him shattered into 1,000 pieces, and the woman disappeared. Shocked by what he had just seen, Martin felt even more compelled to dig deeper into the mystery of this hospital. On the second floor, he found a large, long-abandoned operating room. Rusted surgical tools lay scattered on the table, and dried blood stains marred the white-tiled floor. But the most terrifying thing about the room was the sudden coldness that enveloped it. An unusual chill, as if someone was watching him with a gaze filled with hatred. As Martin tried to walk towards the operating table, the lights in the room suddenly flickered on, blinding his vision. In the corner of the room stood a figure that froze his blood. The woman had returned. This time, she stood before him, not just a reflection in the mirror. Her long black hair fell, covering part of her face, which was riddled with wounds. Her clothes were tattered, and her eyes empty. Martin couldn't move. The woman walked slowly toward him, her footsteps leaving bloody prints on the floor. The closer she got, the stronger the stench became, piercing his senses. It felt as though time had stopped, trapping him in an endless nightmare. "I need to know," the voice whispered again. "Why are you here? What are you looking for?" But before Martin could respond, the woman's figure vanished in an instant, leaving the room in deadly silence. Cold sweat soaked Martin's body. This was no longer a warning. This was a threat. After the woman's figure disappeared in the operating room, Martin slumped to the floor, his heart still racing. The terror he had just experienced hadn't fully left him. He knew there was something far more horrifying in this hospital, and he had merely scratched the surface. Martin took a deep breath and tried to gather his courage. After all, he had come too far to turn back now. He recalled the old stories he had read about this hospital. One of the most notoriously frightening areas was the ICU, where critically ill patients often received their final care. Some tales claimed that the souls of those who didn't survive often haunted the place, trapped between life and death. Despite his heart pounding at the thought of what he might find, Martin decided to head to the ICU. The stairs leading to the third floor creaked with every step, and the higher he climbed, the thicker the air became. The smell of filth and rust mixed with a strange, metallic scent he couldn't identify. Once he reached the third floor, he saw a door with a large sign that read ICU. However, the door appeared tightly locked. Martin approached the door, and suddenly, a knocking sound came from inside. One knock, two knocks, then silence. Martin stepped back, sensing that something was wrong. Just as he started to turn away, the knocking turned into loud banging, as if something inside was desperate to get out. "Don't go," in a soft whisper suddenly brushed against his ear, making Martin jump. He spun around quickly, but there was no one there. The whisper sounded like a woman's voice, but this time it was clearer and more real. "Don't go in, if you want to stay alive." Hearing the warning, Martin hesitated. Yet curiosity once again overtook him. He pressed the handle of the ICU door, and unexpectedly, the door opened on its own, as if inviting him in. The room beyond the door looked nothing like what he had imagined. Instead of a room filled with broken medical equipment, the ICU appeared as though time had stopped. The ceiling lights were still on, and patient beds were neatly lined up, as if waiting to be used. But one thing made Martin's blood run cold. On every bed lay a motionless figure covered with a white sheet. The atmosphere in the room reeked of death. Martin stepped further inside, approaching one of the beds. With trembling hands, he pulled back the sheet covering the figure. Beneath it lay the body of a pale woman, her eyes wide open, staring directly at Martin even though it was clear that the body was dead. And then, the woman's eyes blinked. Martin stumbled backward, nearly falling. His heart raced wildly. The woman wasn't just alive, her entire body started to move slowly, as if trying to rise from the bed. Other sounds began to fill the room. The rustling of cloth, heavy breathing, and faint whispers coming from the other patients. One by one, the bodies in the other beds began to stir. Martin turned and ran for the door. But before he could reach it, a woman stood in front of him. The same woman he had seen in the mirror in the operating room. This time, she wasn't just staring at him, she smiled, a terrifying grin that revealed sharp, decayed teeth. "You weren't supposed to come here," she said in a cold, raspy voice. "Now, you'll have to pay for what you've seen." Martin ran without thinking twice. His legs felt heavy, and his breath came in gasps, but his fear was stronger than the exhaustion overwhelming his body. The hospital's hallways seemed to stretch longer and narrower, as if the building itself was alive, trying to trap him forever. Each step felt like he was fighting gravity, as if some unseen force was pulling at his legs. When he reached the stairs to go back down, the sound of slow, steady footsteps followed him from behind. Martin didn't dare look back. He knew who or what was there. The woman, somehow, was always faster than him. But as Martin reached the stairs, his hopes of escape were instantly crushed. The stairs were no longer empty. The woman haunting Martin stood there, blocking his path. This time, her form appeared more solid, more terrifying. Her hair was tangled, her face more disfigured, with blood dripping from the wounds on her skin, and her dark, empty eyes stared straight at him. "There's no way out," she said in that haunting, dreadful tone. Martin had no other choice. He had to find another exit or at least somewhere to hide. Panicking, he turned and ran down another hallway that curved to the left. His steps came to a halt in front of a door marked storage room. Without hesitation, he opened the door and rushed inside, slamming it shut behind him. Inside the storage room, Martin leaned against the door, trying to calm his breathing. The room was cluttered with old medical equipment and dusty boxes. The dim light above flickered, adding to the gloomy atmosphere. He felt safe for a moment, but just a few seconds later, a knock echoed from the other side of the door. The knocking turned into loud banging, growing more intense and fast, as though someone was trying to break in. Martin slowly backed away, searching for a weapon or anything that could help him survive. But all he found were syringes and old medical tools. The banging on the door grew more terrifying, and then, suddenly, the sound stopped altogether. A chilling silence hung in the air. Martin thought the threat had passed. But without warning, the whisper returned, this time right beside his ear, even though no one else was in the room. "You can't run from me," the voice crawled into Martin's ear, sending chills through his entire body. And in that moment, the storage room door swung open on its own, revealing the now pitch-black hallway. Martin stood frozen in front of the open storage room door, staring at the dark corridor ahead. Fear gripped his body, but he knew he had to move forward. He couldn't keep hiding. The air around him grew colder, and an eerie atmosphere began to envelop every inch of the room. His footsteps echoed slowly as he started walking down the pitch-black corridor. The creaking floor and the sound of wind from an unknown source continued to echo, as if something was watching him. Every shadow on the walls seemed to move with his steps, and Martin felt increasingly trapped in this never-ending nightmare. Suddenly, he saw a dim light coming from a room at the end of the corridor. His heart pounded slightly with hope. Maybe this was the way out, or at least a safe place to hide for a while. However, as he approached, he heard something that made his blood freeze. There was a small laugh, soft, yet clearly audible from inside the room. The laughter was strange, not like a normal human's laugh. It was mixed with sobbing, creating a horrifying harmony. Martin shivered, but his feet kept moving as if a force was pulling him toward the light. When he reached the door, he saw faded writing above it that was almost unreadable. Children's room. The door was slightly ajar, and the laughter grew louder. Martin slowly pushed the door open wider. What he saw made him step back in shock. Inside the room, there were several small beds lined up. Broken dolls and old toys were scattered on the floor. On one of the beds, a small child sat with their head bowed, long black hair covering their face. In their hands was an old and worn doll. The child laughed softly but suddenly stopped as Martin stepped inside. Who are you?" Martin asked with a trembling voice, though he knew this child wasn't an ordinary human. The child didn't answer. Slowly, they raised their head. The child's eyes were empty, devoid of life, only thick darkness. Their lips curled into a sinister smile filled with hatred. "Now you will play with me," whispered the child in a voice that sounded older than their age. Martin felt something was wrong. Instantly, he ran out of the room without thinking twice. The door slammed shut behind him with a loud bang, and the child's terrifying laughter grew louder, echoing down the corridor. Martin kept running aimlessly, driven by the instinct to survive. But this hospital was like a maze. Every corridor he went down seemed to bring him back to the same place. And that laughter never truly disappeared. It was as if the child was chasing him from afar. Martin finally reached another door, this time with no sign. In panic, he opened it and stepped into a larger room. The lights in this room flickered, creating shifting shadows on the walls. In the middle of the room, there was an operating table surrounded by white curtains. Dried blood stained the floor, and old medical equipment lay scattered, leaving behind a terrifying trace of surgeries that had been performed there. Martin approached the table cautiously, lifting the grimy white curtain. However, before he could see further, he heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. Immediately, he turned around, and there she was again, the woman who had been haunting him from the beginning. Her face was now clearer, filled with open wounds, her black eyes staring with pure hatred. "You can't run," she whispered, her voice echoing throughout the room. Martin felt there was nowhere left to run. The entire room seemed to be closing in, as if the walls were moving closer, trapping him. The woman kept approaching, her steps slow but sure, as if she knew there was no escape for Martin. The biting cold intensified, freezing his skin. Cold sweat drenched Martin's forehead, but he couldn't move. His legs felt like they were made of stone, as if his body refused to cooperate. The woman was now only a few steps away from him. Her face was so damaged, her eyes empty, yet her lips formed a terrifying smile. "This is all your fault," she said in a voice that sounded like cracking bones. "You opened the way for us." Martin shook his head, not understanding what the woman meant. "I don't know what you're talking about," he cried out, his voice breaking. The woman only smiled wider. You came here. You called us from the darkness. Martin backed away slowly, but suddenly he felt something behind him. When he turned, he saw the curtain he had just lifted was now moving on its own, as if something was behind it. With his heart racing, Martin mustered the courage to pull the curtain aside. Behind it, there was a large mirror full of cracks. However, what was even more terrifying was what he saw in the reflection. It wasn't his reflection, it was the woman standing behind him, but with her back turned to him. When the figure in the mirror turned around, her face was completely ruined, worse than what Martin had seen in reality. The mirror began to shake, and suddenly, blood-soaked hands started crawling out of the cracks, trying to grab Martin. He stumbled back, but the hands kept multiplying, grabbing his arms and legs, pulling him toward the mirror. "Now you will be with us forever," the woman's voice echoed throughout the room, even though her body had vanished. Martin screamed, trying to fight back, but his strength was no match for the invisible hands. His body was slowly dragged toward the mirror, and when he looked at his reflection, he saw something horrifying. His own face was changing, becoming as ruined as the woman's. Martin was dragged closer to the cracked mirror, blood-stained hands gripping his body tightly. Every time he tried to resist, his strength seemed to drain away. Fear wrapped around him, choking his breath. In the mirror, he could see his reflection, now darkened, his face cracked like the mirror itself. "Don't let them win," he screamed inwardly, but the voice grew weaker, drowned out by the cold wind hissing from behind the mirror. Every inch of him felt submerged in the darkness that haunted the room. Suddenly, amidst the mirror's fractured reflection, another face appeared. It seemed familiar, a doctor in a white coat, but his eyes were filled with pain and fear. His lips trembled as he tried to speak, but the sound that came out wasn't human. It was a faint whisper, as if he was trying to warn Martin. "Don't believe what you see. This mirror, it destroys your soul." Martin forced himself to pause. His mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. The doctor continued, his voice growing fainter. "Everyone who looks into this mirror loses themselves. They become part of the darkness, like me. The mirror wasn't just a lifeless object. It was a soul-destroying device, trapping lost spirits inside, never able to return to the real world. The woman who haunted Martin was one of the mirror's victims. And now, Martin stood at the edge, between life and death, between reality and an eternal nightmare. Martin took a deep breath and struggled to free himself from the hands gripping him. He knew one thing: he couldn't give up. With the last of his strength, he grabbed an old iron rod lying beside the operating table. Without thinking, he swung it hard at the mirror. A horrible cracking sound echoed as the mirror shattered into thousands of pieces. The hands gripping him vanished instantly, as if destroyed by a force greater than themselves. The mirror was destroyed, and with it, the trapped spirits began to fade, including the woman. But before she fully disappeared, the woman looked at Martin one last time. Her expression changed, from full of hatred to peace, as if she was finally freed from the suffering that had bound her for so long. "Thank you," her soft voice echoed before she vanished into the darkness. Martin collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The room felt quiet, but not with a terrifying silence. Instead, there was a peacefulness that enveloped the room, as though something dark had come to an end. But Martin knew this hospital still held many dark secrets. He had just destroyed one soul-shattering mirror, but who knew how many more mysteries lurked behind these walls? After resting for a moment, Martin stood again, his knees trembling. He had to continue the search. Something bigger was at play here, and he couldn't leave without knowing what was really going on in this hospital. All of this had to be connected to his vague past, and the woman haunting him might just be the beginning of a deeper nightmare. Martin wandered through the corridors, this time with heightened caution. Every hallway was eerily silent, but there were faint whispers in the air, as if the hospital walls themselves were speaking. The whispers sounded like fragments of past conversations, screams of patients, prayers from desperate families, and cold orders from doctors. Finally, Martin arrived at a large door that appeared older than the others. Above the door, there was a metal plaque that read, Secret Research Center. Martin's heart raced. As the name suggested, this room had to hold something significant, something that might answer all the questions swirling in his mind. He grabbed the door handle with trembling hands and slowly opened it. Inside, the room resembled an old laboratory filled with ancient medical equipment, research notes, and large tanks filled with a thick green liquid. Inside the tanks were human bodies. Some appeared intact, while others were disfigured, as if from failed experiments. Martin felt nauseous but couldn't look away. He approached one of the research tables and saw a pile of documents, seemingly abandoned years ago. One of the documents was titled, Soul Transfer Experiment. He began reading carefully, and the deeper he read, the clearer the mystery of this hospital became. The scientists here, including the doctor he had seen in the mirror, were involved in research involving human soul transfer. They believed they could save people from death by transferring their souls into other bodies or even into inanimate objects like mirrors. But the experiment ended in disaster. The transferred souls became damaged, trapped between the real world and the spirit world, and the bodies used in the experiments began to deteriorate. The hospital was then abandoned, but the lost souls remained, trapped in the failed experiments. Martin felt dizzy. Everything that had happened to him since he arrived at the hospital started to make sense. The woman who haunted him, the voices from the darkness, even the soul-shattering mirror, all were results of these experiments. And now, Martin felt he was part of a game far bigger than he had ever imagined. But before he could reflect further, he heard footsteps approaching. The sound wasn't of a normal person. The footsteps were heavy, as if something not fully alive was approaching him. Martin turned, and at the far end of the room, he saw it, the keeper of the hospital's secrets. It wasn't human, but something more terrifying. Its body was massive, stitched together like a patchwork of different corpses. Its eyes were hollow, but the hatred in them was unmistakable. And Martin knew this creature wasn't going to let him leave easily. Martin knew this was his last chance. He couldn't fight this creature. His only option was to escape. But how? The room seemed sealed from every direction. The keeper was getting closer, its footsteps shaking the floor. Martin sprinted towards the exit, but when he tried to open the door, it was locked. Panic surged, and he frantically searched for another way out. His eyes landed on a window at the side of the room. It was his only hope. With the last of his strength, he smashed the window and jumped out. He fell onto the hospital's back courtyard, his body aching from the impact. But he was alive. Martin ran without looking back. Behind him, the keeper's footsteps grew fainter, but he knew the mystery of the hospital was far from over. The dark secrets of this hospital have only just begun to unfold. Did Martin escape the terror that hunted him? Or is there something even more horrifying awaiting him outside? Find out the answers to this mystery in the upcoming chapters. Don't forget to share this story if it gave you chills, and stay tuned for the next thrilling installment. Get ready, for the darkness is not yet fully behind.